And so this is the methods that we do. We think it's important to get reliable data. It may sound, kind of geeky, but without information about performance and outcomes, it's impossible to tell what's going on with the system as a whole or individual kids. So what we want to do is look for ways to give counties and the state incentives to do this by using screening and assessment instruments that will track the progress of individual kids so that you can see how they're doing and the whole county's accountable for worrying about kids getting better as a result of being in the system. And that will motivate them to do early intervention and best practices. And I mentioned the developing these funding strategies is somehow we're going to have to come up with some money to move to the early intervention and prevention end of the system. So that's more for you because you know some of this stuff, and I would spend a little bit more time on it. And then this is the stuff that is essentially we go through in the training sessions, and you've probably heard most of before. So this gets to the Child Welfare 101 kind of part of the thing, where we're talking about the legal and organizational framework. So the legal basis for child protection is written into Minnesota statute. It's 626.556 for reporting the maltreatment of minors. Historically, neglect is the most common form of maltreatment. 60% of reports in the last full year that we have. And neglect is defined as the failure of the child's caregiver to provide food, clothing, shelter, and medical care, and to ensure that the child attends school and protect the child from danger. In other words, persons or environmental, either to protect them from people who are dangerous to the child or to have the child be in an environment where there's, where there's rats or there's poison or there's other things that could be harmful to the child. That's neglect. And then abuse is, physical abuse is any physical injury or threat of harm or substantial injury inflicted by a caregiver upon a child other than by accidental means. And this law was amended at some point to specify that, to clarify that this does not include reasonable and moderate physical discipline, because there was, I think, pushback saying, well, there's certain different standards in different communities. And then mental abuse is harm to the child's psychological capacity or emotional stability, evidenced by an observable and substantial impairment of the child's functioning. We'll talk more about that later. But one of the interesting things about the legislative audit report that we'll talk about is they gave one example of pretty clear psychological abuse, and it was pretty much universally screened out as not meeting the standards for child protection. And then sexual abuse is subjection of a child to criminal sexual act or threatened act by a person responsible for the child's care or who has significant relationship to the child or is in a position of authority. Now that's in the law, but one of the areas that is unclear in Minnesota is threatened sexual abuse. What is that? And does the person have to live in a household for it to be a threat? And do the police or does child protection have authority over people who are not in the household? So those are issues that are not consistently implemented or practiced across the state. There's different standards in different counties. Okay, so this is one of the major ones we want to cover. It's a little hard to see, but this is a piece of work that was done by a woman named Jen Racho, who got a degree last year from the Humphrey Institute. And she put together a map that goes to federal, state, local, and nonprofit that shows kind of the major chunks of players and levels within the child welfare system. So she starts up here at the national level. So there are foundations that do research and advocacy and give out money. For example, the National Children's Defense Fund gives out some money. There's a group called the Center for Study of Child Welfare. What is it called? The Center for the Study of Social Policy that do kind of researchy stuff. The big one is the Annie E. Casey Foundation. That's the big national child welfare funding source that is based in Baltimore and does a lot of pilot projects around the country. So that's the non-government sector. And then in the government sector, the big player is the Department of Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families, Children's Bureau. So you've got Health and Human Services, and you've got this huge division called Administration for Children and Families, and under that's the Children's Bureau, which is the kind of top child welfare agency in the federal bureaucracy. And they have a major role in terms of things like, promulgating guidelines for what counts as child abuse and setting up the funding sources and that sort of thing. So there are other big players like the Department of Justice that goes down to the juvenile justice world. Interior and Indian Affairs goes to the Minnesota Bureau of Indian Affairs. They are big players. We're going to concentrate on this column here because that's Health and Human Services is what links up directly to the State Department of Human Services. And then I didn't mention this, but there are organizations like Children's Defense Fund and the Child Welfare League of America that have national, and then they have state branches, and they have a major role in kind of raising issues, defining policy, challenging policy directions, or suggesting them. So here you've got Health and Human Services, and they are kind of the federal agency that the Department of Human Services Child Safety and Permanency Division kind of reports up to the extent that there's a oversight there. And then within the state, there's the University of Minnesota Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare, also known as CASHU, and they get money from the Department of Human Services to manage the data for the state and also do other research. That is, they get money to do research from other areas, and then they also do research for DHS with the data that they manage. There's connections between Child Safety and Permanency Division, which is headed up by Christine Borsheim, used to be Aaron Sullivan Sutton, and the Juvenile Justice, but they're not, they're not well integrated. There's not a lot of integration among these programs and the Department of Human Services Child Mental Health, whether at the top or at the street level. So that's always been a big issue. And one thing that the state tried to do to improve the integration between these programs, because a lot of the kids are in 2 or 3 of the systems, same kid, different system, is set up this thing called the Children's Justice Initiative, and that's when Kathleen Blatz was the Chief Justice. She took an interest in child welfare issues. And so this is kind of an ongoing task force that tries to work on policy issues about integrating these systems. And then within this division, a funding stream is called the Children's Trust Fund, and that's where the federal 4B money goes, kind of flexible money from the federal government for child welfare. And then there are agencies like, I think what Jen meant to say is Prevent Child Abuse Minnesota, which is kind of a statewide group that worries about child abuse issues. There's adoption agencies and the Minnesota Association of County Social Workers. So these are kind of statewide nonprofit groups that kind of are in this universe. And then you get down to the local level, the county level, and you have, for example, she used Hennepin County. You could use a different county, but Child Protection Services. And you have the Citizens Review Panel, which is kind of a blue ribbon panel that's appointed by the county to provide some checks and balances and oversight for the child protection / foster care system. You've got these kind of loose relations at the local level, too, with the juvenile courts and mental health. And then you have schools, relationships with schools, and you have these temporary care facilities, foster care, juvenile detention, residential treatment that are where kids get to from any of a number of sources, including child welfare. And then down here you have a bunch of service providers, mental health providers, family counseling, chemical dependency, etc. So that's kind of a Cook's tour through the federal, state, and local level in terms of major players and how they relate. And you could spend, a whole semester just on this chart, but that's kind of a down payment on understanding what the major layers are and who the players are. So does that make sense? Should I move on?
Yep, it makes good sense. It looks as though it's there's a lot of money, a lot of people involved in things, and it ends up looking like spaghetti here. So
Exactly. And, one of the interesting things in terms of public policy is that when you go to the legislature, even progressive Democrats will say, we're not sure what would happen if we give more money to the system, would it do any good? Because they look at this as well. They may not see this map, but they see how things work and how they fit or don't fit. And they say, well, you really can't tell if the money is doing any good. So that's really important for our strategy, because what we're partly saying is that, if we can tell you, if we can give you information about how the system is working, and make a good faith effort to report performance and outcome measures, then we would hope you would then consider refunding a system that's been badly unfunded over the last 10 years. So that's that. Now we have a different view of the world here. This is our colleague at the U, John Karatekin, and she put together a map of how kids flow through the system, Minnesota's child welfare system, based on 2010 data, and there's 2011 data that's come out recently, so this will get updated. But this was done, for kind of a informal faculty presentation, and John doesn't want to represent it as having, as being ready for publication. So she put this in a format called Prezi, which is this online thing, and we converted it to PowerPoint, one of our volunteers and I. And so, if there are any mistakes in it or inaccuracies, well, they're ours and not John's. But I know enough about the system, and she worked on it enough that I think it's a fair representation of how things go for kids. So if you start up in the upper left-hand corner, you've got actual child maltreatment, and there's a study that's done about every 7 years or so by Congress called the National Incidence Study, in which they go out and talk to a lot of people in the community, as well as the usual kind of child welfare workers and so forth. And they get a broader view of child abuse. And their estimates are about 4% of children nationwide are, meet the criteria for child abuse or neglect, and only about 30% of cases that meet those criteria actually get reported. So you've got 70% of kids.
Your audio is dropped off. I can hear it barely. You there?
How's that? Is that better?
Right now it is. Keep talking, but
okay.
Something changed.
I think I bumped the the thing that with the volume thing. So first of all, you start out with the fact that children are abused and neglected. Only about 30% of them are reported. Then you go into Minnesota. Maltreatment reports. Can you see that, Joe? It's small, but it's really difficult to make it larger without doing a whole lot of manipulation.
It says 55,888 reports. Is that?
Yep. So that's the number in 2010. And then you start weeding them out. 32% were screened in, and the national average for screening in reports is 61%. So there's a policy question or a research question there. Are we just that much better at screening, that we only screen in the ones that are actually, likely to turn into abuse or neglect cases? Or are we screening out kids that we should screen in? And, I think that part of what we have to do is be able to answer that question someday. But 32% are screened in. It's just about half of the national, a little more than half of the national average. And then 68% are screened out. What happens to those kids? Well, a very small number go to this PSOP program, the Parent Support Outreach Program, which is kind of early intervention. Some unknown number, they decide there's no referrals needed, and some unknown number are referred to community supports. So this is the first of many question marks as we go through here, and it's been described by some people that have given this to as leakage in the system, where kids and families just kind of go away. We don't know what percentage, what numbers, or what happens to them. So these are the screened out, but ones that are screened in, a little less than a third. 68% now go to this family assessment voluntary track, and 32% go into family investigation. That's the traditional investigation in the child protection system. It's supposed to be for substantial child endangerment cases, and this is supposed to be for the less high-risk cases. The number that are sent to family investigations is a little higher in Hennepin. It's 40%. Okay, so they go to family assessment. That's supposed to be the higher risk group, the ones they're more concerned about. They're not just going to do as they do in family assessment, go out and do an assessment, but there's no formal finding of abuse or neglect. And they offer voluntary entry to the child protection world. This is not voluntary. They go out and do an investigation, kind of whether you like it or not, and that breaks down to 43% maltreatment is not determined, and 57% it is determined. So now you're down to 18% of the screened-in reports, which was 32% of the total reports. So, and only 30% of the actual out there in the community. So you're getting down to a pretty small percentage of kids who get to this point where maltreatment is determined. And of that, 50%, even though they found maltreatment, they decide services are not needed and the case is closed. Well, maybe there's good reason for that. You know, maybe the abuser moved to another country, or maybe it was a situation that already got corrected, like mom got counseling and she no longer, you know, is drinking or using drugs, whatever. But 50% seems like, intuitively, if you got to the point where you screened it in, sent it to the investigation track, and found that there was maltreatment, it seemed like a higher percentage would need service at that point. But we just don't have the data to answer that question. And then 50% statewide services are needed. It's higher in Hennepin County at 65%. So you begin to see the numbers get to be smaller and smaller as you move through the system in terms of who gets services. And then when they do get services, when they do get offered services, there's not a lot of information about whether they get the services and whether the services were effective. So here, services needed, they go into CHIPS case. This is whatever percentage is left here. Oh, and let me back up for a minute, Joe. Now treatment determined, that's 18% of all screened-in reports, whereas it's 24% nationally. So nationally, of this pool that is screened in, about 50% more there's a finding of abuse or neglect than there is in Minnesota. So again, the question is, are we doing a better job of screening people in the first place and making a good determination of whether there's abuse, or are those numbers low and that means kids aren't getting service? We need to have the information to answer those kind of questions. So then you go to services needed, and they go into juvenile court. The different options are termination of parental rights, reunification, temporary legal, whatever that C is for relatives, state guardianship, etc. So this is where kids who end up in these are options for kids who end up in the court system, and if they're reunified, they kind of go back out the door. But then, backing up here again, you've got over here, you find that the family assessment, 68% go to family assessment. They decide 65% of those don't need services and the cases are closed. That kind of relates to the Citizens Review Panel finding that 75% of people who were screened into family assessment in Hennepin County didn't get even offered services. And then, of the 25% that did get offered services, about 17% actually got them. That's in the Citizens Review Panel numbers. So let's say family assessment, 35% services are needed. And then this was very murky. This we got from the state, or John got from the state, that of services needed, half of them go to protective services, which is high-risk cases. And we don't understand why it goes there, because the whole point of sifting them out here is they're not high risk, but they go there and they offer services, and some percentage just say no thank you, services are declined, and some other percent engage in services, including a few that go back up into the CHIPS world. And there's very little information on whether the services were followed through or effective. So there's this kind of attrition here as well, especially the services decline, case closed. They basically 2 out of 3 in the Citizens Review Panel just said no thank you, and they just went out the door. It was a much higher percentage in our sample so far that just said no, and they kind of walked out. So then back over here, services are needed. They go into the family support services where they get referred to housing and employment, transportation, and those kind of things, and drug treatment and parenting skills. And then we don't know how many times services are declined in the cases closed as services are accepted, but the state estimates total boil down to about 15% of services on the FA track, family assessment, actually accept services. And that's pretty consistent with Citizens Review Panel. But we don't know exactly where the state gets that because there isn't a clear path to get these numbers. You see all these question marks here, here, and here, here. Where there's leakage in the system, we just don't know what happens. So then the question is, what happens in terms of people who kind of leak out of the system here in all these places? What happens in terms of repeat maltreatment? Essentially, the statistics of the state report come out once a year show 16% of family investigation cases have a re-report within 12 months, and 15% of family assessment cases have a re-report. A little bit lower in Hennepin, 13.5. And 6% of family assessment from CHIPS cases in 12 months, and about 5% basically of substantiated cases have another substantiation. But those are re-reports. We don't really know how many of those turn back into another, what happens in those cases. We do know that these, maybe it looks like about a third of these become, or a quarter in this case, get another substantiated. About a third of them get CHIPS cases in 12 months, and about 5% out of the 15 or 16 have another substantiation. But there's lag time in that process of redetermining cases, and we just simply don't know, especially when you get to a child-by-child basis. So that's kind of, in some ways, exhausting to go through that. But the basic points are there's a lot of places we don't actually know what happens, and when you boil down the kids at the front door and how many of them end up actually getting services, it looks to be rather small. So I'm going to pause there, Joe, for a minute, because now I go into, I get off these charts and we go a little faster into, what's the state of the state in Minnesota. So did you have anything to say about this whole business first?
Yeah, I guess I think it's a great chart in terms of just for people to see how the whole system flows, regardless of the percentages that are in there.
Yeah.
And the question marks are worthwhile. It's curious if you were to draw a circle around that area that says CHIPS, juvenile court CHIPS, and that whole process area. How much money is involved in that area versus everything else, which is because it's when you get to CHIPS that you're really in a situation where you basically have just to generalize, non-cooperative adults and children who are at risk and are now put into this process where resources are thrown at the adults and the kids to try and reconcile the situation. And
right.
How much is, are we getting 10% of the monies that are in the whole system end up there, or that's just one point in terms of watching what you're saying, but
well, that's exactly the kind of thing we want to say. We should be able to answer that question, and so
because I know from my experience as guardian, you've got you don't have enough. Group homes are gone. You have a limited number of practitioners who are available to provide psychological evaluations, and it comes down to money. I mean, it says people don't have, the resources aren't there. They'll say, the feeling is the money isn't there. It's not that people don't want to do things, but the money aspect of it has to do with the fact that there is a practitioner out there who's going to provide a psychological analysis, eval. But kids get in a queue because there are too few resources to do that stuff, and so it might take any place from a month or 3 weeks to 6 weeks, 8 weeks to get something done, and a lot can change in people's lives in that area. And I'm just using that one example, but it's I'm just saying that you could sort of put a color behind that area and say that's really where the rubber starts to hit the road. The rest of it's good too, and it's important to know how people take advantage of those things. The assumption I'm making is that, and I'm going to just use 95 and 5% because of the kinds of percentages you're talking about, that 5% of all of the kids and families that can get involved in this graphic end up down in the CHIPS area, and that a lot of other people, there are a lot of other things going on in adults and kids' lives in the other 95% of this and it's sort of not well understood or tracked, or it's all voluntary.
Yeah.
It's,
if let's say this is 10%, just because that number is
no,
going, that are in this realm.
no.
Are they 10% that eventually many of the people here wend their way through this and end up here, or is it people the worst 10% of this kind of end up here and everybody else ends up doing okay or goes elsewhere?
There's also an aspect to it in terms of the racial aspect of these things.
Yeah.
If you
But
go
actually,
over into
it's a
matter of I'll say race, but it has to do with personal financial capabilities. I suspect that a lot of cases that could be over in this right-hand corner get attended to over here because people have money. They're adolescent kids or whoever do something that's of an equivalent to why we end up in chips with some other kids, but they are able to finance their way to alternatives, either to get themselves out of the system early so they sort of disappear for at least for a while, whereas people who are poor, have language problems, those cultural issues, I'll just call it, and gravitate through this thing, I'll say rather quickly just for the sake of it, and you end up in this other box. And that's why when you go in and you go to sit in court for a while, you see you could start to say, and I'm just going to make a broad generalization here, where are all of the Caucasians, where are all the Jews that must have problems with their kids? They don't show up in there. I mean, I'm making broad generalizations because it's an observation I have. Very few. I don't think I've ever had a case with a Jewish family, and I don't know of anybody else that ever has. And I just use that as an example. You could use Somali. You could use anything you want. That there are attributes about the people who end up in that lower right-hand corner grouping that somehow magically disappear.
Yeah, if you take the whole universe, though, of people who can't afford other alternatives,
yep.
Then the question is, is this a funnel where eventually people swirl their way down and a lot of the kids, maybe half the kids that start up here eventually get ignored long enough that they end up here? Or is this the 10% that are incorrigible and they start up in the maltreatment reports, they go straight through family investigation, blank, 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 and they get down here?
Yep.
So do you have an opinion on that?
No, no. I've just my only one is that although I've had a few cases of people who are economically advantaged that have juvenile issue problems in their family, for the most part, the people I have in my caseload, and I see other people having, that's a rarity. It's a statistical percentage, and generally I see people who may have be well off and have the ability to keep themselves, I'll say, in the other aspects of this grid. If their child goes and does something of a delinquency nature, then they can pop over into here because the delinquency pulls you into that.
But I'm asking a somewhat different question, and it's an important one because we keep getting back to it in these discussions, public discussions. The question is, let's say that there are no Caucasians in the system. It's 100% Black and Native American, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or just take the 50% that are Black and Native American, which is half the system here.
Right.
Are there a whole bunch of people who don't get very deep in this, who go to family assessment, or they kind of fix themselves, or they go down this path, and then there's a group that is kind of doomed from the start, if I can put it that way, that there's such difficult families, there's such abuse going on, that they're 15% of the system up here, and they're the 15% that end up here. They're kind of like the group that works its way through here, whereas the other 85% somehow, find some help or age out of it before they get there. So these are, what the point is that the counties were making and some of the other folks is, it's not fair to judge the system as a whole by what goes on here. because these are the worst of the worst. And I'm saying they may be the worst of the worst now, but 10 years ago, there were things that could have been done to help these kids and these families, at least in a lot of the cases I've read. So is it the worst of the worst, or is it the last 10% of the continuum that many, many people go through and end up here? You see, am I explaining it right? What I'm saying?
I think I know what you mean. I mean, obviously, I don't have an answer to that at this point, but I think that's an important question.
Yeah.
You know,
and what I see with the cases I've read, of course, they're all CHIPS cases, but I see many times, some of these cases have been in the system 8, 10, 12 years. There were many steps along the way when they could have provided some services and kind of stem the flow, you know, stop the bleeding. And they just kept pushing the people out the door. There were no services, and by the time, you know. So I'm seeing that at least some percentage of these cases didn't have to end up here. You know, they weren't the incorrigibles initially. So anyway, onward here. So here's the state of the state. And this is where I'm giving people that don't have much information the background. We're one of 11 state-supervised, locally administered departments. The State Department of Insurance has weak authority over counties. I think that's generally acknowledged. I don't think that's controversial. The legislative auditor brought that out in their report. The legislature contributes only about 10% of the cost of child protection and foster care, so that's the second lowest in the country. And, of course, children of color are overrepresented throughout the system. So this is just a framework, Joe, for people who aren't real familiar. Minnesota investigates about 1/3 of reports of maltreatment compared to 2/3 nationally, and I would question that by saying we don't exactly know what that means, but it's something that we ought to know what it means. I hear persistent reports that some counties are limiting access to child protection system, particularly neglect, and children in middle school and older. I went to a kind of a hearing that the legislative auditor held, and 45 people came there from youth shelters and around the Twin Cities area, and they went on a rant. They just yelled at people at the legislative auditor for an hour and 15 minutes, saying that you can't get child protection to do anything about a kid once they're 12 or older, no matter what. And they just tell the school worker or the youth shelter person that the kid is old enough to kind of pick up and get out of the dangerous situation and go to a shelter. Well, I don't think that's a good enough answer for a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old. But that's what these folks were saying to the legislative auditor, and for whatever reason, the legislative auditor decided not to put that in the report. But I was there. So I hear that, and I heard some of the school social workers had the same experience. And then I think I might have to modify this and take it out. But this is, I feel this is true, and then it will come out in the wash, but it might be too much of a red flag or in front of a bull right now. But what I'm seeing in these CHIPS cases is children are left in abusive situations for long periods of time when it's clear that they're at risk, and they just often a family assessment will close the case, and by 4 or 5 years down the road, you know, it's a mess. Sometimes
I think the issue I have with that, you're talking about taking it out, it's that the word children needs an adjective in front of it or a qualifier. The way it's written, it implies, you know, all children are in that mode. It really is some, qualified group of children.
Yeah, even if I said some children and explained who it was, that's a good point. Yeah, I'll do that. And then the return home without services. So just basically verbally our findings, and I probably can't remember them all, but what we found with we're up to about almost 80 cases now. So, you know, we're getting to almost a statistically significant number for, you know, what's there in the court system in a year. So over 80% who are in the CHIPS petition have been in the system before. That's no surprise, but it implies that, you know, they were in the system. You know what happened. 2/3 or nearly 2/3 of them are left in a situation or put with kin or somewhere else in a situation where they are re-abused after the court case is opened. And about 1/3 of them are the cases closed where there's still significant unresolved safety issues. So, you know, mom is still doing drugs and is not, you know, showing up for her UAs. or mom says, I still think the best way to discipline kids is to beat the crap out of them, and, you know, she yanks her toddler by the arm and, you know, just about dislocates her shoulders and walks out of the courtroom, you know, whatever. This stuff is, you know, documented in the court's records that the issues that brought them in the first place are still, you know, unresolved at a level that's high risk to kids. So those are the things we're seeing. And then, of course, the family assessment ones where they're off, they just are, the case is closed without any services being offered or without being received. So that's just verbally when I'm telling you some of the findings that we're not going to be able to share for a year or so. Okay. Minnesota, the policy direction, this is also nationally, but is emphasis on what's called a strength-based approach. The whole concept of the family assessment, I want to tell people, is that it's trying to build in family strength. It's trying to avoid having them spend huge amounts of time in the court process, but to go through a more kind of family-friendly process with family assessment. And that's up to 70% of child protection cases and is in law as the preferred alternative for cases whenever it's possible. And then there's this parent support outreach program that gets a very small number of kids, maybe 5% or fewer, go to this, but it's a kind of an early intervention process. There was a pilot of this family assessment in 2001 and written into law as a preferred option in 2006. So that's just kind of an introduction to what is this family assessment. And then there's wide variations in implementation. As I mentioned, 75% of family assessment in Hennepin County are not even offered services from the Citizen Review Panel. 17% get services. But if you look at Washington County, they, you know, in these cases where they're not offered services are closed. So one of the things that the Citizen Review Panel said is these should not be counted as family assessments. They should be counted as screened out cases. But if you look at Washington County, when they move into family assessment, they say, you know, this is voluntary in the sense we're not going to have a finding of maltreatment, but we expect you to work with us, and if things don't improve, we will move you into the family investigation track. So, and the caseworker maintains responsibility for that case. Whereas in most cases in Hennepin, they close the case, and if they do provide services, they refer them out and close the case. So the worker's not responsible and goes to whatever service agency, and that's it. So very different ways of approaching this. There was an evaluation of family assessment in 2006. Overall, there were positive findings, but the outstate counties were statistically overrepresented, which is important because Hennepin and Ramsey County workers, which is what this was, it was polling workers, were significantly more negative about whether children were safe in family assessment. And so we think too much weight is given to this study that's based on now 8-year-old statistics, especially since it was weighted. Hennepin and Ramsey County were not weighted, and it might have changed the findings significantly. But the main point is you can't use it for ongoing program management to see if you're doing what you should be doing with family assessment. Okay, then the Office of the Legislative Auditor, and we've all introduced the fact that Safe Passage was instrumental in getting this report done, showed several things, that there are very wide variations in county and tribal agencies' assessment of what counts as abuse and neglect. And state screening guidelines do not have the force of law, so local agencies developed a lot of their own guidelines on top of the guidelines from the state. And their guidelines include things like community expectations and unwritten office custom to decide about maltreatment. So that's the kind of reason why the legislative auditor said that there's not a lot of consistency about what is considered to be abuse and neglect across the state. Other key findings were terms are not defined in state law clearly. Important terms like injury and educational neglect are not defined clearly in law, so they want to fix that. And they found wide variations in data. Which cases are being counted as child protection? Some are screened out by a receptionist or screened in, but the screened out ones might be counted as child protection cases in another county that has a more specialized approach where you call it child protection unit. Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't enter cases into SSIS, the screened out reports, or sometimes they just get busy. And so they may not include screened out reports, and then some counties include just enough information to be able to identify a re-report, and then others keep enough information to, you know, on the allegations and the reasons they were screened out, so that if they continue to be referred in, they can see whether there's a pattern of abuse and neglect. And they don't have the same standards on how long you keep the data. So these are important in terms of accountability and in terms of just knowing what's happening to kids as you go through the system. Especially since, as I said, repeat reports are a critical factor in determining how many times a particular family or child has been brought to the attention of the Child Welfare Agency. So, for example, in Carver County, Dan Koziolik shared a report, and I'm going to see if I can use it, where he has one kid was reported 25 times, one kid was reported 24 times, nobody at 23 or 22, but 4 kids were reported 21 times, and so forth. And when you get down into the number of children who were reported, say, 12 to 15 times, it's like 25 to 40 kids in each of those buckets in a very small county. So one of the things we want to do is be able to see how many times kids were reported, how many times they were screened in, how many times they were offered family assessment, what happened to that, did they get services, and so forth. We want to be able to track it all the way through. And this idea of not keeping data about these reports is contrary to state law, because you're supposed to take into account a pattern of maltreatment in screening decisions. So already right now I'm beginning to feel like this has been going on, this section has been going on way too long. Let's see, and I think that these are 2 important points, though, so let me make them. The auditor found that some local agencies, and the way they put it is indirect, you really have to think about it before you get what they mean, but they may require persons who report suspected maltreatment to meet all the standards for maltreatment before the case is screened in. What that means is the school social worker or the school nurse or the teacher that reports it has to virtually prove that it is maltreatment before they'll screen it in. And I know how this goes because my wife would come home. I could almost role play it for you. She would come home and, you know, in utter frustration about a call that she made to Child Protection. And they would say, well, you can't prove the kid's is suffering from malnutrition, get a doctor's report. Well, they don't have the authority to get a doctor's report. That's why Child Protection's there, you know. And I heard that same story from other school social workers in those groups. So that's what this legislative audit report found. And, you know, I can corroborate it from those other stories that that's how it looks to those folks. But, you know, it's sort of like a catch-22, that the people who are reporting have to kind of prove that it's child abuse before they'll look at it. And then the guidelines on sexual abuse are unclear. The legislative audit report put some scenarios out there about a sexual predator who had gone through treatment, and, you know, was it okay for that person to be living in the household, or a sexual predator that they thought might have access, but they didn't have proof whether they were around and had access to. Would that get screened in or screened out? So there needs to be a tighter definition of what counts as sexual abuse. You know, and that's going to be part of what we want to propose as legislation, is to clear that up. Okay, so that's the state of the state. Now going to the national level. So do you have anything to suggest there?
Just a sidebar in terms of the whole area of sexual abuse is deserving of a lot more discussion in terms of things that go on in family situations with the adults and then with the kids. You know, kids. I don't want to go into all the details here, but that whole guidelines for sexual abuse is unclear is an important topic in our society. There is so much that goes on in that. It's like you're peeling back the onion. You don't know what you're going to find. But
you're saying that it's a bigger topic that needs to be explored generally, or do you think I should say more about it here?
No, I don't think you need to say more about it there, unless, you know, like for instance, if you were to say that only 5% of all cases coming through have sexual abuse, most of them are maltreatment and neglect. what's the ratio would be sort of interesting to know someplace in the data to see the weighting on those kinds of things, because sexual abuse cases are really tough and really hard, and you get kids who sort of offend once as a 10-year-old or whatever, and then they're sucked into this system, especially if they end up not getting into it early enough, and then they commit one or two encounters, and then they look like a pervert. So whereas it's just like a 10-year-old kid who makes a mistake, doesn't understand the context of everything, and 10 years is probably not accurate, but I have kids who are that young who get involved in the system, and it's very often due to abuse by a family, relative, somebody, friend, boyfriend, all this kind of stuff, and they're just sad situations. And the kids, like I had one kid say to me, he said, he was 18, 19. He said the way his life had gone on his whole, he said, I was 14 years old when I did that, and he's, it was just sad because he was saying he had done a stupid thing way back when. He was smarter now, and yet he's saddled with this thing for the rest of his life. Or,
and I've got a nephew that's in that situation, so.
And it's sort of a bit, there's a difference to it for that than there is for a kid who, I'm not diminishing in any way, a kid who's maltreated through malnourishment or egg neglect and those kinds of things, or physical abuse of some type. The sexual one gets into psychological abuse, and usually my experience, and just about I bet every other guardian you talk to, you're just looking at the tip of the iceberg when you see a kid who has a sexual, it's a rat's nest. You go, and that's what happens. Some adults, they won't let you get near the facts that are related to the case to try and even address them adequately. The kid gets sucked into the system, gets thrown into all kinds of services, regional treatment centers, all this, and you'll leave behind the adults who actually perpetrated this on the kid. And so that's why I say it's a whole topic that you could get into in and of itself.
Well, yeah, and then just on the legal end, the other points I could have made here but didn't are that the law is unclear about what is the responsibility of child protection, what's the responsibility of police. For example, if there's a person in a position of authority who is, a coach or whatever, that usual kind of thing, Boy Scout, who there's an allegation of neglect. There's one section of the state law says that that's Child Protection Agency's responsibility, and another says that it's not, that it's the police department's responsibility. So there's issues like that. Well, that's helpful. And then I covered some of this national incident study. I already talked about a little bit of that. In this, the last one, they've been doing this for 30, 40 years. The last one was the first time that they showed that the incidence of abuse among African Americans was higher than the population as a whole, and it's partly because they've expanded the number of counties. But I'm not sure that's actually helpful to put that in there, and I'm not sure what it exactly says. So apparently,
I would say unless it's definitely leading you to something substantive, it's not necessary.
Kind of get you off track. And then there's some efforts at kind of more management of the program, continuous quality improvement in Utah, Alabama, Wisconsin. Those are things that Minnesota should look at, see if we can learn anything from it in terms of how to improve the program. The strength-based approach, family assessment here, it's called differential response. It's a generic term. Is an effort to try to build on family strengths and so forth. We have questions about how it's being implemented, but the concept is good. And then there's a new federal direction now to start measuring outcomes, and that's part of where we're going. So this is a whole long stretch, and there's no way we're going to get through this. But I'm going to do a flyby here, just so you know what we're talking about. There's a new commissioner here named Brian Samuels of Administration of Children, Youth, and Families, and he is basically saying, look, here's a growth chart. Kid starts out underneath the 10th percentile here, and you work with a kid, and eventually their height and their weight, start to move up into something like the normal range. So what he wants to do is say, when a kid comes in the system, you do an assessment of the major domains in their life, and I'll get to that in a minute. And then you track over time, are they getting close, are they doing better or worse? Are they getting closer to the norm or further away? So they can start anywhere. You know, it could be a kid who's developmentally delayed. It could be a kid who's older. But the question is, are they getting closer to the norm, or are they the same or further away? And he says we ought to be measuring kids in terms of cognitive functioning, physical health and development, social functioning, and emotional and behavioral.
Isn't that something that really is best implemented at the school level? It's sort of like, I don't, you know, to me, it's like I could see a social worker in a school saying, you know, I've got a kid who's off the chart here after some series of, I don't know what they would be, you know, let's just say the 4 categories you got there.
But I think if they're in the child welfare system, his point is the child welfare system has to take the lead and make sure that we are tracking how kids are doing. And it may involve the schools. In fact, probably would involve the schools. But by the time they get to the child welfare system, that's who should take the lead.
But is that tracking of all children, or just children who are in the process that we're talking about?
Yeah, kids when they get screened into the system, into the child welfare system. So this is about the child welfare system.
Okay.
Only those kids, yeah. This is what is the child welfare system's responsibility for helping kids do better once they're in the system. So I'm just going to skip that. This is about the impact of maltreatment on brain development. You kind of know that. And it triggers, you know, kids on constant alert, overinterpret signs. These are all the things that go wrong when you've been traumatized. And then he's got these typical programs for youth yield poor outcomes. So he's got tutoring, mentoring, life skill training, employment, et cetera. And basically what the research is showing is they don't make any difference. So what he wants to do is say, let's scale down the ones that don't work and scale up the ones that do. And so you want to have evidence-based treatments for trauma or whatever else we're talking about. So that's where the federal direction is going, where he's going to try to target the money. And so he'll say, look, here's some common concerns, and then the evidence-based interventions. Screening activity to identify mental health and behavioral health issues. Okay, here's screening tools. These are a bunch of tools that are well-normed. They've been used thousands and thousands of times. They're consistent in the results.
Your audio has dropped off again.
Oh, you know what? I'm hitting this darn button here, and I'm not realizing. Is that better?
Yep.
Okay. And, you know, here's the age ranges they cover. Some of these are quite inexpensive, and they can be used with by social workers and teachers. You don't have to have a psychologist do them. You just have to have a reasonable amount of training. So, and then he's saying, okay, here's common mental health diagnoses like ADHD and opposition defiant. Here's a bunch of therapies that work for them that are well-normed and well-researched. Parent-child interaction therapy, multi-systemic therapy, which Hennepin uses, etc. And here's some screening and assessment instruments for major depression. So he basically says there's a lot of evidence-based interventions out there, and there's a lot of well-normed assessment instruments that can be used to see where a kid's at. And Safe Passage's proposal is going to be every time a kid hits the system, you know, they re-enter the system, you do these assessments, and you see whether since the last time the kid was in the system, do they get better or worse, with the idea that over time, you're going to say, you know what, this kid's been in and out of the system for 10 years, and you know, they're not doing well, and what did you do? I mean, that's basically the idea. So this is more of the same. It's, you know, it's a bunch of child-parent psychotherapy, parent-child. These are for different things like post-traumatic stress. And so he says, look, functional assessments, traditional child welfare system use assessment as a point-in-time diagnostic activity, you know, to see where a kid is at and what services they need. But a functional assessment looks at multiple aspects of a child's social and emotional functioning, involves a set of measures that account for the major domains of well-being. So rather than using one-size-fits-all, the federal guide, you know, Brian Samuels says, let's do a more comprehensive assessment, figure out what their skills and their needs are, and then appropriately respond to that. So this is more, I think I can do with less of this. This is the same thing where valid and reliable instruments for screening and assessment. And so Safe Passage's approach is going to be, we need to look at this as a state. We need to come up with kind of a core package that we expect people to use, and we want them to use it on an ongoing basis if a kid's in the system every 3 to 6 months, depending on their age, if they're coming into the system to do it when they're screened in. And then we end up with a child welfare system to focus on improving social and emotional well-being. So you look over time and you say, we want you to be accountable for things getting better, not worse. So this is more of the same ages and stages questionnaire, Bailey, infant neurological. I think I can take one of these out. You just use these. So I'm going to skip Utah and then talk about this is where we're going with it. And here's the chart. It explains it. What we want to do, legislative agenda by year for safe passage. We want to improve maltreatment reporting. These are the legislative order recommendations. Try to get legislation for that. We start getting reliable maltreatment data in 2014. Children start getting screened in or screened out for child welfare services appropriately. Then what we'd like to do is try to get a process going after the legislative session to start planning the use of those screening and assessment instruments. And then, after a year, task force comes back and say, these are the 5 we think should be used by everybody, and there's 10 more that can be used for special situations, and we expect people to start using them and tracking how kids are doing. Then you start getting improved data on how children are faring in the system over time, and then you start getting at least improved child outcomes. And then, because we can't do everything at once, in 2014, we want to propose to analyze the family assessment data, basically plug the leaks, improve the family assessment data, and then start to get improved child outcomes because you can see what's going on and you can say, we didn't need to do more of this and less of that. And then finally, evidence-based interventions to analyze them, implement them, which would mean the legislature would have to have more skin in the game and put some money into it, and they also contribute to improved child outcomes. So that's the basic.
Before you leave that graphic, that's a powerful graphic, both as a visual, and when I saw it, I was thinking, my 2 cents is to have that at the beginning of your presentation or earlier on, not to go into it in detail, but to talk over it. Not even, you might mention 1 or 2 buckets in there, whatever, but to talk over what we're talking about here is this. This agenda, the strategy for Safe Passage, what Safe Passage is about, sort of, is these kinds of things, and you're going to go into more detail about that by your presentation as to why these things make sense and why, something like that. I don't know.
Okay, no, that makes sense because it's a way to give an overview, and it's also a kind of a colorful slide, and it's got some energy to it.
Right. That's how it hit me when I first saw it. And it's to, you want to go from the 2013 improving maltreatment reporting down to the lower right-hand 2017 of improved child outcomes. That's the thrust of what everything we're going to talk about is all about, and we'll return to this slide later on for some more detailed recap.
Okay. All right, I'll do that. That's a good suggestion. Great. Let's see. I don't know if I've got more. I think that's the last one. Maybe. I think I need to.
Yeah, you're coming up on 451 here. I don't know
okay, so
bounce you off or not?
I don't know how that works. I don't think so. I think I pay. No, I don't think so. But I can't get out of this. I can't get out of the slide. You know how you hit escape. There it is. Yeah, I think that is my last one. All right.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to turn off the recording and